A slave becomes queen and later is sainted for her work as an abolitionist. This is not the plot of a new romantasy novel, but the true story of a medieval French queen told by Isabel Moreira in her new biography of Queen Balthild of France. Welcome to the Virtual Jewel Box, podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. I am Scott Black, Director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and today I am joined by Isabel Moreira to talk about her wonderful new biography of Balthild of Francia. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on, Scott.
My pleasure. Dr. Moreira is Distinguished Professor of History and Associate Dean for Research in the College of Humanities at the University of Utah. She is a world-renowned expert on the Merovingian period of French history and the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of the Merovingian World, and the author of two scholarly monographs, Heaven's Purge, Purgatory in Late Antiquity, and Dreams, Visions, and Spiritual Authority in Merovingian Gaul. So, Isabel, this is a fantastic read, much better than most academic biographies. It's quite a story, and it sounds, as I said, more like the stuff of high fantasy or romance than history. Could you start telling us just a broad overview of Balthild's life, her incredible story, and why it's important?
Yes, thank you. Her life is truly remarkable. And, as you say, you could imagine it being a novel. She is a well-known figure in France. She is a saint of the Catholic Church, but she started her life as an Anglo-Saxon slave who was bought for, we are told, a low price by the mayor of the Neustrian Palace in Francia in northern Gaul. And she ends up being married to a Merovingian king, Clovis II, has 3 children by him, is widowed, becomes regent for her son, and then finally, after some political issues, she is relegated to a monastery, essentially a political exile for the rest of her life.
I do want to get to those political issues because it's fascinating. But first, I want to focus on her regency. She was able to be a political figure and a queen because her son was underage. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. And in the 7th century, there were queen regents. So she is sort of fitting a model there. But it is because she's widowed really early. Her son is very young. And so for the duration of his childhood, she essentially wields power in his name, together with some other key political figures.
So I'm really interested in the various ways she gets represented over time. There were really historically 2 lives of Balthild, right?
That's right. So there was the life that was written very soon after her death. This is commonly known as Vita A. It's the first life. It's the near contemporary life. But in the Carolingian period, another version of the life was written, which categorically stated that she was of royal birth. And that was very much what the Carolingians wanted to believe about her. And her royal status was very important for the convent and its fortunes going forward. For most of the French readership in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries and 19th century, they would have been reading French accounts of her life. What's important about that is that the French accounts of her life derive from the B version of her life, the Carolingian version of her life. So French readers believed that she was from a royal background. And so that is the view that dominated over the centuries. Periodically, people did go back and look at the Vita A at the first life, but they had to go to extra effort to find that. It was not even the Latin edition that was in every set of Vitae Sanctorum. You had to go and find that life to discover her more common origins, let us say.
Really interesting. And it's interesting because I think for us, for you, that first life is really the more valuable, and it's closer to it. Potentially people who knew her could have written it, but also it has some really striking details. There are descriptions of her body, her look, her cheerfulness, which you don't, that kind of attention to her body is not what you expect of a saint's life.
No, that's right. I like to give credence to this first life. I think because it is so contemporary, that it shows us a version of Merovingian society that seems very strange to us. But the second life shows us a more medieval view, right, in which being royal is so important. The first life is very interesting. As you say, there was this sort of description of her body in the life. They talk about her being sort of svelte and how good she is to look at and how beautiful she is, and that she's kind of smart. These are not the descriptions that are conventional to saints' lives, descriptions of women at this time. Most of the other saints of the Merovingian era, the female saints, are noble women, and they are described very discreetly. So I thought it was really indicative that Balthild was coming from a different social milieu, that the ancient biographers could sort of look at her and describe her in a way that seems frankly quite intrusive when you compare it with other works of this time.
So the Merovingian world was influenced by Rome. It was a very different kind of place than the Anglo-Saxon world that Bathilda must have been born into. What would it have been like for her to come from what now we would call England into Gaul?
Yeah, so Anglo-Saxon England was not as Romanized as Gaul was. There had, of course, been Roman Britain, but much of it had been destroyed, the sort of the buildings and so forth. And the Anglo-Saxons themselves had been accustomed to building in wood. So, yes, it's very much a wooden world. And when she comes to northern Gaul, she's encountering a late Roman world in which much of the infrastructure of Roman cities must still have been around and visible. The Merovingians themselves seem to have built in stone, or at least they were capable of rebuilding stone buildings, although they also built royal palaces in the countryside out of wood. So I think the biggest cultural shock for Balthild would have just been how prosperous Northern Gaul probably looked by comparison to Anglo Saxon England.
In your book, you talk about some scholarly speculation about her background. We actually don't know anything about her. We don't know her status. We don't know exactly where she's from, but you have put together some informed speculation. Where do you think she's coming from socially?
Well, so this is the one of the big questions that we have about Balthild, and over the centuries, writers and historians have thought of her differently. Was she a noble woman who was captured from England, or was she an ordinary person? Was she in fact a slave in Anglo-Saxon England who had been traded? And we don't really have a lot of evidence for this. I have my particular view, and I do elaborate that in the book. I believe that she was of low birth, as our earliest written testimony indicate, and that she was part of the movement of peoples in who were slaves or captured, and that's how she comes to France.
And the slave trade is fascinating at this time. It was a common practice, I believe, across Europe and across this late antique world. Could you tell us a little bit about the slave trade itself and slavery more generally?
So, France, like most of the Roman Empire, was based on a slave economy. So, the France that Balthild came to, like the one she came from, was a world of slaves doing labor. In France at this time, many slaves were basically employed to do domestic work, to work in the fields, to do the kind of labor that the prominent families and the elite were not going to do. In terms of the trade, however, This is really hard to gauge, how much is going on at this time. Our sources clearly indicate that people are being traded, perhaps not as much as in subsequent centuries, but it is significant, and the sources are recording this. So she is coming from Britain to France as part of a trade that is already established. And we know that because we have sources slightly earlier that are telling us that these men and women are being brought over the channel to France.
So when she becomes regent and becomes queen, she abolishes the slave trade, but not slavery. Is that correct?
Well, yes, so she is renowned for having made a prohibition in her kingdom that states that slaves should not be transported across her kingdom or within her kingdom. There had been some earlier legislation that slaves should not be traded abroad. What she does that's different is that she adds to that and says, no, they cannot be traded within the kingdom. And I think that's really important because a trade where you cannot move people at their destination, I mean, it's a way to dry up a trade that she could otherwise not have controlled.
Interesting. And this is one of the innovations she made as a queen. I want to get back to some of the controversy around her as a political figure. But first, I think we should back up because you mentioned the first biography, the first hagiography that we have of hers, but that's not the only source we have or the only source you're using. Could you sort of sketch out the range of different Bathilds there are out there
Right.
in text?
So we're really fortunate to have some very good sources for her life. The first is a hagiography, A Life of a Saint, that was written probably within a decade of her death by people who could have known her. So, an excellent source. We also have a Carolingian biography that is obviously of a later date and that has certain other kinds of information to relay. But in addition to the written work, we also have material items. Because she was a saint and because her community was able to preserve her remains and some of her artifacts across the centuries, we actually have parts of her skeleton, we have clothing, we have her hair, which is just an amazing artifact. So we have other kinds of sources for her. And in addition to sort of the formal hagiographic work, she also appears in annals of the time. And she also appears as a secondary figure in some of the other lives of saints, mostly bishop saints of the time. So we have quite a lot on her, in fact, to go on.
And some of the stories that are going around about her in some of these annals are not by her fans.
That's correct. So she gets a particularly bad rap in Anglo-Saxon sources, where she is called a Jezebel, where she's accused of having murdered 9 bishops. And this simply isn't true. Of course, she was part of a political system at a time when bishops were being murdered. However, it is certainly an exaggeration to say that she murdered 9 bishops.
And that was not the reason she was sent in exile to the monastery.
Well, it may have been a sort of a knock-on effect repercussion of the bishop's murder, but essentially she falls foul of the politics. She's very instrumental during her time in power in keeping a balance among competing factions. And so eventually she loses that game and she is put into exile in the convent that she had founded.
So her going to the convent, you think, is not strictly voluntary.
Oh, it was absolutely wasn't voluntary. And in fact, it seems that when she joins the convent, that there was some opposition to her doing that. So this was a very bad time for her when this happened. She loses power. Her son is now king, but under the influence of other power brokers. She herself is sent to this convent, which she had founded, but I don't think she ever anticipated being a nun in the convent.
Was she a nun?
Well, so she wasn't a nun initially, I believe. In fact, she spends about 15 or 16 years in the convent before her death. And I believe that she only became a nun probably in the last year of her time there. Her hagiographer wants us to believe that she became a nun immediately, that this was a religious conversion, that this was what she had always wanted to do. But there are good reasons for thinking that that probably wasn't the case, and that she hoped, perhaps, that a reversal in her situation, having once happened, could happen again, and she could see herself return to power.
One of the really interesting details you talk about is the fact that the lock of hair we have of hers is dyed.
This was discovered in 1983 when the archaeologist team under this archaeologist Lapore, they examined the hair and they saw that it had been dyed. Her original hair color was a sort of strawberry blonde, but it had gray in it, and the dye had been made to match the rest of the hair so that it would look as if she was not going gray.
That's fascinating. And it does suggest she probably wasn't a nun if she was concerned with her hair.
I think the other thing it says is that her hair was likely on view as well.
Hmm.
You wouldn't bother dyeing your hair if it was under some kind of elaborate headdress or a veil or anything else. So I think that she was keeping up a royal appearance really until her last illness, when she perhaps decided that it was time to give up secular ambitions and see the rest of her life in the convent.
The science of archaeology that you talk about in the book is also really interesting. You discuss the ways that historians and archaeologists can use scientific methods to really closely pinpoint origin, place of origin based on the food they ate. This is fantastic science.
Yes, right. Now, I should sort of preface this by saying that, with the exception of the hair and the bones that are now in the parish church, that these scientific methods are things that we are not really able to check her for. The problem being that much of her skeleton was given away over the centuries. But the scientific methods that you could potentially use would be to do isotopic analysis, which can tell you a lot about a person's diet, especially their protein diet, whether they ate mostly meat or whether they ate mostly fish, that sort of thing. The thing that was really interesting to me is this use of strontium analysis of the teeth. If we had Balthild's teeth, we could do analysis on them that would enable us to know where she had spent the first years of her life. And that's because the teeth sort of essentially hold a footprint, like a geographical footprint of where a person has spent these early years. And this can be done by sort of looking at like the kind of water that they would have drunk, for example. And yeah, it's an amazing sort of thing. Unfortunately, we don't have her teeth. There are also opportunities to look at her bones. For example, you can tell when somebody was weaned from breast milk. But again, the problem is that, we don't have access to the teeth because we don't have them. And her bones are relics, and they are, although they were examined in 1983, they're now back in the reliquaries in the church. And I'm not aware of any plans to re-examine them at this point, even though now we have better methods of examining them.
It's fascinating. And just the thought that we can so closely pinpoint where someone lived based on this very little material is terrific. You also point out that it's location and geography that determine someone's health over their life rather than their status. That's really interesting too.
So I really went into this when I was writing the part of the book that dealt with her childhood. So we know absolutely nothing about her childhood because none of the written sources addressed that. However, when I was writing this biography as part of a series, the editor and the reviewer said, well, still, we would like to know something about what her childhood could have been like. And so I did some explorations into this to try and find out, what her life there could have been like, and how those sources could be used to reconstruct that.
Really, really interesting. I want to move into the sort of final part of your book on her afterlives, her importance for later historians and later artists and literary figures. There's a rich set of materials that talks about her, or maybe doesn't talk about her, but uses her as the basis for some romances in the 19th century. Your book starts and is framed by a discussion of a statue of her. Could you talk a little bit about sort of her afterlives, her various afterlives, including what you call her as an abolitionist saint?
Yeah, so she does have this very sort of varied afterlife in the sources, perhaps starting with the Middle Ages. She becomes the subject of some very strange stories in which she is represented as the mutilator of her own sons. And that storyline does get picked up in the 19th century by an artist, Luminet, who paints a picture of this event. And so with the Anglo-Saxon stories about her being a Jezebel, and then these medieval stories of her mutilating her sons, we definitely have a very unusual trajectory for this saint. Of course, at the same time, the memory of her is being kept fresh in the convent of Chelles, which persists. The convent of Chelles remains active until the French Revolution. And so for them, she is the perfect queen and nun. And she's often represented in a nun's habit. So they're very much interested in her as a royal figure and as a monastic figure. And this changes in the 19th century when we suddenly have this image of her as an abolitionist. And I was very curious to know how that had come about, because, of course, during her life, she had done much to try to rescue slaves in her kingdom. But through the Middle Ages, she wasn't known for that. And even through the early modern period, the abbesses didn't seem to reference her as a freer of slaves very much. So for me, this was very intriguing. I wanted to sort of go back, look at the sources, and try and figure out at what point does this become an important part of who she is represented to be.
And it sounds like that happens really because of the abolitionist movement in the beginning of the 19th century in France, where they want to reclaim, I guess, a foremother.
Right. Now, this gets to be a little tricky because, of course, what I wanted to find is that she was always thought an abolitionist for the abolitionist movement, because that would make a great story. I really did a lot of work to try and find that information. And we know we have these abolitionist societies in the 1830s and 40s, but I couldn't find any references to Balthild herself. So this sort of added to the mystery as to why the sculptor had chosen to label her as an abolitionist in 1848. It's not that the memory of her freeing slaves had been lost entirely, but it wasn't a hugely strong part of the abolitionist culture up until then. I even speculated to myself whether the fact that she was a female potential abolitionist was designed to encourage women in France to become abolitionists. But unfortunately, again, I hit some roadblocks there. I couldn't seem to quite find the right kind of connection, even though we know that there were women involved in that.
I mean, this suggests that all biography is shaped by assumptions that are local to that particular time, to the moment it's being written, and assumptions about what makes a good life or a good life story. Your biography is continuing that. You're thinking about Bathilde in our terms. I wanted just to sort of conclude by asking, what do you think our assumptions or your assumptions are about what makes a good biography, what makes a good life story, or what makes a good life?
That's an interesting question, of course. For me, I was trying to find sort of what is the hook for Balthild? What is going to resonate with modern audiences? And I really felt that both the statue in the Luxembourg Gardens, which is where most people might actually know her from, and her reputation as an abolitionist would have most relevance to readers today. Of course, Balthild in the 7th century was not doing exactly what abolitionists were doing in the 9th century. Although I do think that there are some ways in which they are similar. She was attacking the slave trade, and that was also the approach of the abolitionists to try to stop the trade. So in that regard, there were some kind of convergences there. But Balthild as a 19th century icon of abolition is interesting because it really related to that moment in time when a sculptor like Terrasse and perhaps his associates saw an opportunity to make a political statement. And in the book, I offset this with another image of Balthild, which is done by the very famous painter Anger, who's very well known for painting these obelisks, right? He creates an image of Balthild, and I use that for the front of the book. That image is of a very sweet looking, saintly woman. She's dressed in secular garb, but as a queen, she looks very feminine. And she's there really as a representative of the royal house, which had descended from the Orleanists. And so there was sort of a lot of connections there for them. So when Victor Terrasse, the sculptor, put on his statue Abolition of Slavery, he inscribes it on the book that she holds. He was making a new statement about who she was or could be. And I mentioned that this was this moment in time because within months, the monarchy was deposed. King Louis Philippe, who of course had been behind the statues in the garden, the Luxembourg Gardens, he was deposed, and Victor Terrasse doesn't have the same kind of patronage thereafter. So it's sort of this particular moment in time when it was meaningful, and then suddenly sort of didn't become meaningful again. And the next sort of big cultural moment is the painting by Luminet of the tortured boys. And I think, for the 19th century, this is sort of whiplash between, here she is as an important political figure. She's always been a saintly figure, and now she's a mutilating figure. And I just found this really fascinating. And I hope that readers would find this fascinating also.
It's a terrific history and a terrific sort of scholarly exploration of both her, but also how someone gets remembered. I'm really struck also by your comment that your editor really wanted something about her childhood, because that says something about the kind of figures we want in our biographies, which are fully rounded people who lead ordinary lives. I would guess there's nothing about what she ate in the hagiography or the political
Right.
representations.
Yeah.
So it does say something about what we think a real life should be, how to tell a story, what the significant parts of a biography are.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that as readers, we're curious about these other aspects of somebody's life. And because of archaeology and other sort of scientific opportunities, there are ways of fleshing out her society and sort of seeing her exist in the 7th century. Yes, I was also surprised by the request to write a chapter on her childhood because it's like, well, go ahead, write a chapter on something that sort of doesn't exist. But in the end, I thought it was a very useful exercise, and it does help give us a sense of a person who lived. And that's really what I wanted to come out of this biography, is to have a sense that a person of the 7th century had a life that she could live, that she could have a family, that she could preside over a court, that she could have political ambitions, and that she could be remembered for many, many centuries. I just find this fascinating.
It's an excellent biography. I really enjoyed reading it, and I've enjoyed talking with you. Thanks very much, Isabel.
Thank you, Scott.
You have been listening to the Virtual Jewel Box podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. Our theme music is Jelly Roll Morton's Perfect Rag. Thanks for joining us.